We'll start at the Emirates where Arsenal drew 1-1 with Man City. Mark, you were there. A lot of questions about Mikel Arteta's approach before kick-off about the team he picked. What did you think? Do you think he was too negative or do you think it's been a bit of an overreaction?
I think it's been a bit of an overreaction, to be honest. I think we can all be clever with hindsight, can't we? But, Bukayo Saka, for instance, didn't start because he hasn't been playing recently. He wasn't fit to start. And I think, why would he start him in the biggest game of the season, I guess, to date? Because having lost at Anfield, this was the biggest Arsenal face now. So he had to be pragmatic about it. And he's still not got any Martin Odegaard because Odegaard isn't fit. So I think he had to pick the team that he had in front of him. And obviously, Madueka's had a great start to the season. You can't knock that selection. Trossard was the unusual one, was the surprise one. But for me, Arsenal still had the players to win the game. I just think that, Pep had a game plan. Pep Guardiola had a game plan and it worked. And obviously City scoring first made it much easier for that game plan to work. If you've got the pace of Haaland and Doku on the counter-attack, exploit it. So, yeah, I think there's been a bit of an overreaction. I think it was the same case when Arsenal went to Liverpool and lost to a wonder goal from Dominic Szoboszlai. In that game, they pretty much deserved to get a draw, but it's just the fine margins. So, but the flip side is, they played the two biggest rivals for the title now and haven't beaten either of them. So I guess that is something you can hold against Arteta in the sense that the best coaches in the world have got a gambling streak in them. When they need to get a result, they'll go for broke, won't they, rather than be a bit more cautious. And Arteta still may be a little bit on the cautious side.
Do you think that the reaction would have been the same had there not been a similar reaction after the Liverpool game? Because he got accused at Anfield of not really coming to play. I suppose some Arsenal fans will have looked at the team before kickoff and seen that maybe Eze's not in there and thought, you've kind of done it again. Because it's happened twice in kind of quick succession, do you think that that's kind of added to this narrative around Arteta now?
Yeah, potentially, because, they spent so much money this summer, haven't they? And I guess they are out of excuses now. Mikel Arteta is out of excuses that everything that he's wanted, he's got. He's got the centre forward in Victor Gyökeres, who was pretty quiet against City. So there are no real flaws in the team, but I'll go back to Odegaard again. Odegaard barely played at Anfield. He played late in the game as a substitute. So Arsenal really miss him. They really miss his creativity through the middle. And I think when he doesn't play, they can only go out wide and teams don't know how to stop that. So Arteta's built a squad that's got a replacement or cover for every player in the squad apart from Martin Odegaard. But, we don't like to talk about players that aren't playing, that aren't available, because you have to focus on those that are on the pitch. But he's a big loss for Arsenal. He does make a big difference. And I think what Arteta did yesterday, he had the best squad at his disposal. And I think they did okay. They could have won the game, but it was just, like I say, we're in the business of kind of scrutinising and trying to, break down straight after the game what's gone wrong. And I just think there was a bit of an overreaction on Arteta. I think, they still got a decent point out of a game against Man City and they could have won the game, really.
City and Pep have obviously been scrutinised as well. You mentioned there that it looked an awful lot like he came to play on the break. Obviously, they scored a goal through Haaland on the break. Towards the end, he seemed to kind of go more and more defensive, perhaps more defensive than we've seen him do in the past. I mean, when I was watching that game, I was reminded of that Feyenoord game last year, right in the middle of their bad run, where I think they were 3-0 up. And usually when City teams have a lead, you see kind of Pep trying to defend by just keeping the ball. You just keep the ball and the other team would get near it and you would run out and win 3-0 and the game would be over. Obviously, that Feyenoord game, that didn't happen. For the first time ever, they looked really, really vulnerable in that sort of situation, and Feyenoord pegged them back and in the end drew 3-0. When I was watching that Arsenal game yesterday, it was almost like he was still scarred from that a little bit. And instead of trusting his players just to say, look, we're 1-0 up, we've only got 20, 15 minutes to play, we're going to just keep the ball and not let Arsenal get it. Instead of doing that, he went to kind of this ultra defensive mode and threw on a load of extra defenders, took Haaland off, although I think he said afterwards that Haaland had sort of said, I'm struggling and I need to come off, but chucked on a load of defenders and tried to win the game in a purely defensive way, rather than in that kind of Pep offensive way that we've seen in the past with City players just kind of keeping the ball and not letting Arsenal play. Were you surprised at all at how Pep and City approached those last sort of 20 minutes? Do you think that it's fine to defend like that in a situation like that, or have you got a slightly different view?
No, I think it's totally fine. I actually love the way that Pep Guardiola's gone about it. I think, it won't be the podcast if we didn't talk about Ruben Amorim. We're talking about one coach in Amorim who is completely wedded to one way of playing. Now, Pep Guardiola's no doubt the best coach in the last 20 years, if not beyond. And he's given us so many different styles. The way that they're playing this season, City, is totally different to the Barcelona team that he had, and certainly the first generation of a City team that he had. So, Pep has really evolved, and he's moved with the times. And you'll have seen this as well, because you watch City more than I do, I guess. But I was quite close to the pitch at the Emirates yesterday. And one thing you see about the City team is the one he picked yesterday, they're all, apart from Bernardo Silva, they're all huge. Nico O'Reilly must be 6'4". Donnarumma 6'5". Even Kuzhinov looks like he's gone away for 3 or 4 months and really bulked up. They're a very big, imposing side now, Man City. Obviously, Haaland up front, 6'4", 6'5". So Pep has kind of evolved the game, knowing that, especially against Arsenal, it's a team that will always try and beat you with set pieces and, being physical at corners they're renowned for it. So Pep has realised the game's changing. The game is now becoming, as Thomas Tuchel said, about long throws and, long balls and cross into the box. So Pep Guardiola, if he maintained his reputation as being a tiki-taka coach, passing it around and using, little ball players as he used to have at Barcelona with Xavi, Iniesta and Messi, that wasn't going to work in the modern game. So he's changed his approach to work to it. And that, for me, is why he brought in Donnarumma. Donnarumma's presence in the box yesterday basically nullified Arsenal's threat from corners. But obviously, late in the game, Martinelli scores that goal where he catches Donnarumma off his line. But that wasn't down to his physical presence. Donnarumma's made a big difference with his physique in a team that has, over recent windows, become much more physical and powerful.
It's interesting that the last season, Pep, at one stage in one of his press conferences, said that he thought that the Premier League was kind of moving away from his sort of tactics, that kind of positional setup that he's had when he first joined City. And he was praising the likes of Brentford and Brighton and Newcastle for this kind of like really quick, transitional, direct, I suppose at times, football. And there is a school of thought that he's kind of seen the way the Premier League is moving and hired Pep Lijnders because of that, because he still likes his team to have the control. And he said in the past in a news conference that he'll always love 1,000 million passes, but he has admired a lot of what Liverpool did under Jurgen Klopp and Pep Lijnders, and the way that they were able to win the ball back very quickly and then attack very, very quickly. And that he's seen in his City team that there's room for kind of improvement in that area. And he's almost like he's trying to merge the best parts of his great City teams with the best parts of that Liverpool team under Klopp. And we saw yesterday how quickly they attacked for that goal, and the one that Haaland scores with Reinders, and then Haaland, sort of racing half the length of the pitch and scoring on the break. I mean, do you see that City again are kind of changing and moulding and adapting, and perhaps this kind of, the City team that we saw that would just be camped outside the boxes of everyone and just pass until there was an opening and a goal? Just you see City kind of moving away from that into a more kind of direct, quick, I suppose it's, heavy metal football kind of team.
Yeah, it's more athletic, I guess. But I mean, that goal he scored at Arsenal was a classic Liverpool goal on Jurgen Klopp, wasn't it? It was, you could basically, if that was Mo Salah playing rather than Haaland, you wouldn't be surprised at the rapid breakaway. I think it was always in Haaland is kind of evolution as well, because it was only 18 months ago that Roy Keane said he was a League Two player, didn't bring anything to the table apart from his goals. Well, that goal he scored at the Emirates was, he started the move. He won the ball in the centre circle in his own half, led it off to Reinders and sprinted forward, and Reinders obviously spotted the run. But what was interesting in that as well, just going off at a tangent, was how Gabriel, his marker, just jogged back and completely left Haaland to escape him. So that was a real Lijnders kind of goal, that, in the sense that rapid counter-attack, and the work that he's been doing on the training ground is basically based around, learning to counter-attack like Liverpool did. And the City players are learning a new way of playing. But yeah, like I said, all credit to Pep for spotting the changing trends and being big enough and clever enough to move with the times. There's nothing worse than a coach, no names mentioned again, who only sticks to one way of playing. Pep has shown he's gone from one extreme to the other, and he's mastered both.
Well, just one last question on these two teams. Then obviously Liverpool have won 5 from 5 and are right at the top of the Premier League. Did you see a genuine title contender in either Arsenal and City? And if so, which one is the more likely to challenge Liverpool?
Well, I went to the game thinking that Arsenal would win quite easily, so that shows how right I was. But I think Arsenal have got the credentials. I think they do need Odegaard fit, and Odegaard's probably doesn't stay fit long enough. But I think with him fit all the way through and Saka fit, I think Arsenal have still got a great chance of winning the league. But City surprised me yesterday. I thought that City have now got something back. They're not the free-flowing team that they used to be. I think they've got fewer individual star players. But when they play Liverpool at the Etihad, I think in beginning of November, that'll be a really interesting game, because if by then City will be much more comfortable in playing this new way under Pep, they've got the physique, they've got the pace, they've got the players fit, then they can they can actually beat Liverpool. And I think what City have got is that ability to go the course and distance. They've done it before so many times. Yes, it's a changing squad, but Guardiola and a lot of the players know what it's like and what it takes to win the title. So if they can beat Liverpool, it'll be a laying a marker down and showing that they're not going to win. They had a bad season last year, but they're still around. And I think City can win the league. I think if they've got a chance of winning it when they get to January, if they're still in with a shout, you'll probably see them go again in the transfer market and add somebody else to the squad. So I think City are definitely a contender, but I still think Arsenal have got the edge in terms of quality. But I think City got the edge in terms of experience and know-how.
Well, next we'll go to Old Trafford, where Man United got a much-needed 2-1 win over Chelsea. Mark, we were both there at Old Trafford, rain-soaked Old Trafford on Saturday night. Obviously, quite a chaotic game with everything that happened with the red cards and things like that. But do you think United deserved it in the end?
They deserved the win, yeah. I think they started the game really well and scored early, which they haven't done enough recently. And then obviously the game was all over the place because of the red card that Chelsea had early on with Robert Sanchez. It changed again when Casemiro was sent off. And that seemed to knock United back. So it's really hard to judge United in that game because had they won the game 11 versus 10, then we'd have all said, well, they've only beaten 10 men, so what are they really like? Second half comes around, it's 10 versus 10, and it doesn't really give you an accurate picture. So all that came out of it for me from a positive perspective was that they've won the game. They've won the game, they've got 3 points, the crisis has subsided. It's not over, it's subsided, but I guess we have to see where they are after the Brentford game and the Sunderland game before the international break, because if they win those 2 games, then all of a sudden we'll be talking about Man United in the race for the top 4 and everything's fine. Amorim's system started to work, but I mean, we haven't seen Amorim do back-to-back wins, I think, since the very first weeks of his career as United manager. So that's the big question there. Can they sustain it? Obviously, Casemiro will be suspended at Brentford at the weekend. So there are a lot of questions to answer still with United, but the win is the win, isn't it? And I guess, you cover United every day, Rob. I guess that, from your perspective, is the fact that they've won the game and it is a case of a bit of calmness can return to Old Trafford for a week at least.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it just buys Amorim some breathing space, because another defeat, after what had happened at the derby, would have just, seen it descend into even more sort of chaotic week with the speculation around his future heading into that Brentford game. So I think, sat in the post-match press conference, he did look like quite a relieved man. Actually, Luke Shaw spoke in the mix zone afterwards, and the first thing he said was, the main feeling is relief. And I think that goes through the whole club, really, because we've been through this situation so many times before with different managers that, when momentum starts building against you with defeat after defeat after defeat, really these wins are really much needed, particularly for the manager and the players, just to kind of give them a break from everything, all the noise that's going on around the club. In terms of Chelsea, Mark, they were obviously massively affected by Robert Sanchez's really early red card. Maresca, I think, has got a little bit of stick for how he handled that. He brought 2 of his attacking players off, and there was quite a major reshuffle. Do you think that Maresca helped Amorim with the way that he did reshuffle after that red card? Do you think that they kind of played into their hands a little bit with that?
No, I don't actually. I think that it was just unlucky that Cole Palmer went off 10 minutes later with a groin strain. I think, I've never seen a manager do 2 substitutions following a red card, but you could see what he was trying to do. I think what he was planning to do was, knowing that United have been really kind of low on confidence, really, I think he felt he could smother the game, suffocate the game, I guess, and really, really frustrate United, get the crowd on the backs, get them nervous, and then hit them on the counter-attack with João Pedro and Cole Palmer. But obviously, Palmer went off, and that meant that the plan went out the window. But I can see what he was thinking, because we know that United are quite fragile, and if Chelsea had scored before they did, or if they frustrated the crowd, it would have got really, really negative inside Old Trafford. But that plan, if it was the plan, went out the window when Cole Palmer went off on 20 minutes. So having to use 3 subs in the first half meant that they were really light on options. But Chelsea still, they clung on long enough, and they had enough threat. I think, Reece James was probably the best player on the pitch for them. I think João Pedro looked sharp. They could have hurt United. It was just a strange game because of the weather, the red cards, and the whole mood of the game. But no, again, I think Chelsea have been a little bit harsh to criticise. I think Maresca has as well. I think he tried to do something different, but it didn't quite pay off because of circumstances later on. But one thing I want to ask you, Rob, there's 2 things that struck me. First of all, about the selection was from Amorim was the goalkeeper. He stuck with Bayindir, and very late in the game, Bayindir spilled a cross which could have led to a Chelsea equaliser. And then he he took Harry Maguire off late in the game, and he's got this thing about taking centre halves off, midway through the second half. Now, I can't imagine Virgil van Dijk or Ruben Dias or William Saliba being substituted by their manager. So why on earth is he changing his centre halves? And also, when's he going to put Sonny Lamans in goal?
Yeah, I mean, the goalkeeping situation is interesting at United now, because in my mind they've got 3 number 2s now in Bayindir, Lamans, and Tom Heaton. I accepted what Amorim said about Lamans and the Manchester derby, that it was a massive game, high pressure, a couple of days after he joined from Royal Antwerp, but not sticking him in for Chelsea suggests to me now that in his head Bayindir is his number 1. Now, he was asked that exact question in his press conference ahead of the game on Friday. He said, is Bayindir now your number 1? And he says no. Every player's got to fight for their position every single week. Now, he kind of has to say that because he needs to keep the rest of the squad interested. But it just, the sense that I get is that Lamans is a young goalkeeper with, United think, is a lot of potential, but just isn't quite ready after just one season in the Belgian Pro League to play as a Premier League number 1. And while he's getting up to speed, they've got to pick Bayindir now, because obviously Andre Nana has gone on loan to Turkey. I think Bayindir is a worry, and you saw right at the end of that game against Chelsea why he is a worry, because he didn't really have very much to do, couldn't do anything about the goal that Chelsea scored really, but in stoppage time a ball gets whipped in from the right hand side, and with all due respect, a really good goalkeeper under that pressure will just come out and catch the ball and take the pressure off his team. And he didn't. He kind of punched it back into the penalty area and caused a scramble. And luckily for United, they were able to get it clear. I think that there may be issues with Bayindir moving forward. And then the only alternative right now is Sonny Lamans, who clearly, judging by how United have treated him, isn't really ready to be a number 1 in England. So I think it's a difficult situation for Amorim now. I don't necessarily think that he envisaged this being his goalkeeping situation at this stage of the season. I think it's just something he's got to deal with now, an extra problem that he doesn't really need. In terms of the centre halves, I mean, that I can understand why a lot of United fans don't like that the switching of centre halves, and he has done it quite a lot, Ruben Amorim, and a lot of United fans have pointed it out in the past. In Amorim's defence, I genuinely think that this is to do with the load of the players, that he is petrified of overplaying players and causing injuries.
Play once a week.
Well, no, but Harry Maguire's not played, has he? He's not played. He can't possibly be match fit. So he's thrown into a game against Chelsea where it's quite intense. The weather's not helping. He plays 70 odd minutes instead of Lenny Yoro. And at 70 minutes, we've seen in the past that different times tick by, whether it's 60 minutes, 70 minutes, or a little bit later. And Amorim, regardless of the score or the situation of the game, will take a player off. And he's in his head, particularly last season, some people around United were saying that in his head, he's just thinking, I've been told he can only play 70 minutes by the medical staff. I need to get him off because I want to play him next week. I don't want to lose him for 6 weeks. And you have to remember that the season he came in last season, the one before it, was absolutely decimated with injuries under Erik ten Hag. It basically ruined the entire campaign. And I'm pretty sure that Amorim has been told that what happened under Ten Hag and maybe some of the kind of mistakes that were made with Eric and how he used players and pushed players. And Amorim has decided, even last season, that he's just not going to push players past what they would call their red zone. So the minute he's told by the medical staff, this player is in danger of getting an injury, he's allowed to play 60 minutes, and regardless of whether a score is 3-0, 1-1, 2-1, whatever it is, he's going to take him off. And I genuinely think that's what he did with Harry Maguire on Saturday. And I can understand why United fans in particular look at that and think, I don't really like that, because you're making unnecessary changes. You kind of making the team panic when you don't really need to. But in Amorim's mind, he needs to keep his best players fit. And he would much rather take Harry Maguire off after 70 minutes and then have him again available to start against Brentford on Saturday than pushing for another 30 minutes and maybe losing for 2 or 3 weeks in a situation you just can't afford to lose his best players.
Just on Bayindir, I think it's worth reminding people that he was signed by United 2 years ago in the summer window because he was basically cheap and he was available. It was a deadline day, or very close to the deadline day move. £4 million from Fenerbahce. Not really a goalkeeper with any great pedigree, but United had Jack Butland in the number 2 role the season prior to that. He was left on a free agency, went to Rangers, so they were desperate for a number 2 at the start of the season. So they got a guy who was, not that good, and he was a number 2 last season. Didn't play very well when he came in. Saved a couple of penalties in a shootout. against Arsenal, which seems to have got into Ruben Amorim's head that it makes him a great goalkeeper. But you're right, he's a number 2. And I think, he's by far the worst current number 1 in the Premier League. I think we've said this before, but I think Lamans, obviously needs to bed in. He needs to get used to the club league, used to the Premier League, used to the ball that they use, because we know that some clubs have blamed the ball in recent weeks. But I think, with Brentford away and Sunderland at home, and then it's Liverpool after the international break, you can't risk putting Senny Lamans in at Anfield for his debut. He has to play against Brentford or Sunderland. I think the slip or it was a slip. It slipped out of his hands in the last minute against Chelsea at the later stages. That for me, that's Bayindir's reason to be dropped, because it was another mistake which could have led to a goal. And I think the weekend is the perfect chance to bring him in. He's got to play him sometimes, Lamans. He's got to play him at Brentford or against Sunderland. So, but one question I would ask, and then it's not one you can answer, I guess, but what is the goalkeeper coach doing? George Vital is the guy that famously Ruben Amorim said that he would rather him play ahead of Marcus Rashford at 63, but he's not doing much to the goalkeepers, is he? He's had Andre Onana went backwards last season. Bayindir is not very good. Tom Heaton is a good, steady goalkeeper that never plays. So, United have had over the years quite a few goalkeeper coaches, but I'd love to know what this current guy's doing.
Well, and he's got his hands full at the moment, because he's probably thinking, where's my number 1? His goalkeeping coach is only as good as the goalkeepers he's looking after. And I imagine, as I said before, Ruben Amorim, he'll never say it. And it was interesting after one of the news conferences we had recently, right at the end, he was asked about, I think it was Kobe Mainu, and he turned around and he said, I am always going to tell you that I love my players. Always, always, always. And it was as if he was sort of saying, I'm always going to tell you that, even if I don't love them, behind closed doors, that even if I feel a different way, kind of when I'm sat in my office, I'm just never, ever going to tell you that. And I get the sense that maybe he's having that kind of feeling around his goalkeepers, because he would never, I don't think that the plan was ever to have Altay Bayindir as his number 1 for this season. And as I say, it certainly looks right now like that's what's going to happen, because, you mentioned there about Senna Lamans and when does he get put in? Well, when does he get put in? Because there's not really an opportune moment now. There isn't, a Europa League game to stick him in where United are probably going to win anyway, regardless of the team they pick, or, a Carabao Cup game because they've been knocked out. There aren't going to be these games, these kind of breathing space games anymore with this season. It's going to be Premier League game after league game after league game. And you might look at the Brentford game and think, well, it's a perfect opportunity to stick Lamans in to give him a little bit of a taste. Brentford, if they got wind of that, would look at that and go, this is fantastic. A young kid coming from Belgium to make his debut at Brentford on a Saturday morning when he probably doesn't want to be there. They'll be absolutely licking their lips. There is no great time for Senna Lamans to come in. And I think that means that Bayindir will probably carry on until he makes an absolute howler, which, judging by his performance at the end of the game against Chelsea, could be any moment.
I think Brentford would prefer Bayindir to be in goal, to be honest. I think,
I think so.
Bayindir over everybody, let's be honest. But anyway, after the break, we're going to chat to Nedum Onuoha about the pain and the difficulty of being left out of the squad and being forced to train on his own, like Raheem Sterling has been at Chelsea. So in recent days, we've learned that the PFA have got involved at Chelsea with the situations of Raheem Sterling and Axel Disasi. 2 senior players, both on long-term contracts at the club, have been told by Chelsea coach Enzo Maresca they have no future. They've been training away from the first team squad. Raheem Sterling posted a picture on Instagram last week of him training at 8 o'clock at night. He's got a young family in London, but he's having to train at kids' bedtime, I guess. So it's not been easy for Sterling or Disasi. Now, before we discussed with Nedum Onuoha, who had a similar situation at Man City, Nedum, what do you feel about the treatment of Sterling and Disasi, and also the 5 players at Man United this summer who were also forced to train away from the first team?
So I think it's really quite poor, to be honest. And I think of it like that in so many different ways, because firstly, it's not just happening at Chelsea. It's not just happening at Man United. It's happening elsewhere, all around the country. But the stories don't necessarily get told because they are very easy to be forgotten about, those types of players, because we spend so much time worrying about, starting 11, subs, transfers and so on. But in reality, there's a lot more to it. And I think when you hear that, someone like Sterling's training at 8 o'clock, yes, people say, well, if I'll train at 8 o'clock for this amount of money and so on and so forth. Well, in reality, you get the most joy from yourself as a professional when you're doing your job, when you're playing for your team. Best case scenario is when you're training with those peers. These are your friends. You're playing games of football. You're playing well. You're winning games and so on. But when you are in a position to where essentially that you're training at a time which is almost designed to inconvenience you, to cause you to make a decision which you shouldn't necessarily have to do, I don't really like that. And I think my perspective, because when I talk about my side of things, this is from 2010, early 2010s. The PFA's lightly stepping in now. I think this is something that should have been taken out of, say, the pro game, in my opinion, from a long time ago. Because I think players, they don't really have as much leverage as people believe that they do. And the clubs essentially do. And they'll say, oh, but we're allowing them a chance to train and so on. But there's so much more to it than that. And to also mention the point that you said right at the start, there's not even a guarantee that those players have been told directly by Enzo Maresca that they're not part of the plans. Very often it's told by other people. And the players don't even get a chance to speak up and try and deal with it and have a one-to-one conversation. It's more a case of, well, somebody tells me that I'm not allowed to be here anymore, so I'm going to go elsewhere. And at that point, like, where's your head at?
I mean, obviously, Maresca was pretty cutting in his remarks last week. He was asked about it, and he said, oh, well, my dad's been a fisherman for 50 years, and I'm not quite sure what the relevance of that was, but, you worked for an Italian manager, had similar kind of hard-line methods. Roberto Mancini. Do you see some sort of comparison between Maresca and Mancini at the moment?
Right now, I think in some ways, yes. I think from the start of the season, or in fact, it was the start of the last season, there was so much discussion about how Chelsea have got too many players. But Maresca was like, oh, not really. I'm going to work with X amount of people, and that's all it is. Now, if you're part of that group of people, then great. But if you're not, it doesn't feel like he's somebody who would even consider bringing you back into that mix. And obviously, clubs can have too many players, but it also doesn't mean that you have to separate them in a manner whereby, the players don't even see each other, because that's something that gets done, which again doesn't really get spoken about. Some of the times, the players who are outside of that group, they get told that they can't come into the training ground until the other group are finished. Well, what's the reasoning for that? It almost feels like it's hard to not take it personally. And again, to put it into perspective, when you find yourself in that sort of group, if it was due to discipline, then you can kind of deal with it a bit better. But some of the times, it's just because they say, well, we maybe you earn too much money. Maybe you're not really part of my plans. But why does that mean that should now be held against you in a manner, which means that, as I say, you end up suffering a little bit more, well, not a little bit more, a lot more as a player. So yeah, with Mancini, with Maresca, with some of these other managers, it's disappointing because you feel like you lose that human side. And if you've had it before from that same manager, that gap in the middle is something which almost, at times, you can't help but breed resentment towards the man in charge.
And have you noticed as well that when this situation happens, the fans never seem to take the side of the player? No matter what the situation is, it's always the club is right. And I think, we've had a summer whereby, Alexander Isak, Johan Visser have caused controversy by, I wouldn't just, if I was saying going on strike, but making it clear they want to leave. And the players have turned them. But the flip side is a club can treat a player really badly, as the situation we've seen this year, that a contract means nothing if the club wants to get rid. So when fans say, they're being well paid to do the job, they're being disloyal if they want to leave, where do you sit on that?
Yeah. So I am essentially quite heavily pro player. And I know that lots of people are almost against that, with the way that Isak did what he did. And so many people saying, oh, Isak's gone about it the wrong way. You should look at the way that Gay he did it, and so on and so forth. But I think essentially each player is different. Each player has a different level of leverage within their football club as well. And I am a believer that loyalty is a great thing, but it's even better when it goes both ways. And I think sometimes for players that I've seen across the years, when things are going well, the club seems super loyal to them. But the moment they want change, then everything changes with that. All of a sudden, it's like, no, you go train here. Oh, no, we'll say, oh, yeah, you can go. We can do this, we can do that. So with that in mind, there are lots of players who do everything they can to almost protect their own interests. Like, if they want to get a move and the club aren't going to allow them to do it, well, what do you do now? Are you trapped? Are you actually trapped in this contract of employment? The chances are you're probably not. So you hear stories about people maybe kicking up a fuss in train and so on. I think the Isak situation with him essentially gone on strike. Like, that's as clear a message as you can see. And that bridge was done. There was never going to be a position whereby he was going to be there in September. But the other side of it is Newcastle then ended up getting like over £100 million for a player that didn't want to be there. That's a deal which I think seems pretty good for both parties, essentially. So yeah, I am more pro player. I think my issue at times is that narrative can always be led by the clubs, and the clubs will also then be believed by supporters because that's what they've done for the majority of their lives. But the more players that you see, the more players that I played with, and then more stories that I saw, from a young person thinking that everything's very straight, everything's very cut and dry, I just want to be here, just do this, just do that. You start to realize that people are on journeys whereby different methods are needed for different moments. And I'm not against everything, because essentially if I was in the same situation, maybe I'd do the same thing.
So Raheem Sterling's got 2 years left in a contract. reportedly worth £300,000 a week. Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Why didn't he just take a pay cut and go to Fulham or to Brentford and play for 50 grand a week? You know, he wants to play.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, actually. Firstly, because as a sort of like as a player or as somebody who's earning any particular type of money, firstly, do you have to take a pay cut? You love football, but do you have to take a pay cut? Because essentially Chelsea have, if we're talking about Raheem Sterling as an example, obviously we could talk about Disassi and so on. If Chelsea said that this is how much they can afford to pay you as a player, then that's essentially what your value is as a player. Okay, well, fine. Well, we can't afford to pay that anymore. You need to go elsewhere. How many teams immediately have a big interest in terms of, say, trying to bring in Raheem Sterling? They'll probably say, well, it's too expensive. So does Raheem Sterling have to go around the club saying, listen, don't worry about how much that costs now. I'm going to come in for less. At a point where Sterling is probably approaching the point in his career where earnings are potentially maximized as opposed to going the other way. Okay. I think for me, the bigger topic, which goes beyond the money itself, because nobody knows how much he wants, how much he expects, how much he needs, and so on, is the fact that, like, especially as you get older, the decisions you make about where you play a lot of the times are dictated by external factors like family, for example. Mm. Like, where are you going to find the most happiness for yourself as a player? Because you could say, oh, I'll take a tenth of my salary and just go and play anywhere in particular. Like, well, listen, we all love football, but the more you play, the more you realize how much of a job it is, especially with the bad experiences that sometimes come with it. So yes, it's not that simple. And I think the clubs themselves don't necessarily make it that simple either. He will want to play, but he'll want to play at the right place because he's currently at the lowest point he's had in his career to date. So why should he pursue something if he knows that isn't, or if he believes that that's not necessarily going to make him any happier either?
No, listen, I was playing devil's advocate. I agree. I think that, you know, if a club wants to get rid of a player who's on big wages, it's their mistake. They haven't rectified. It's not correct. Yeah. You know, their mistake is giving the contract in the first place. But I mean, let's talk about your personal experience because, you know, first of all, when you're basically moved away from the first team group by the coach or whoever, how are you told? Are you told, or is it just a case of like you just find out?
Yeah, so my situation, this was, I said this was Roberto Mancini in the 2011-12 season. And it was 2 days before preseason was about to begin. And I got a message from someone who was essentially the club secretary saying that, like, don't come into training on the Monday, come in on the following Saturday. So, you know, naive me initially thought, oh, brilliant, they've pushed preseason back and have a little bit more time off. And then a moment later, I was texting, I think it was like Sean Wright, Michael Richards and so on. No, they were starting their training on the Monday. And they were training Monday through Friday and then flying to the US on that Friday. And then myself, I think it was Wayne Bridge, Roque Santa Cruz, Craig Bellamy, Manuel Adebayor, possibly one more. We're going to be training with basically the youth team. And the youth team that didn't really train at Carrington normally anyway. So that was a weird moment and a weird sort of like entry into the season because at that point, like, what do you do? Do you just turn up on that Saturday or do you say, no, I'm going to come in on the Monday and try and talk to the manager? Well, no, they've made the decision. You're not part of these plans. And look how late in the day it was as well. You know, we're talking 2 days before the preseason's about to begin. So anyway, we came in the following Saturday, realized we were training with 16, 17-year-olds. Is this really going to be helping us? Absolutely not. Is it going to be helping them? Probably not either. I remember there was a kid, a centre-half, who looked like he was going to be a really, really good player. After 1 month of having to train against Emmanuel Adebayor, the kid lost all his confidence and he was back at the academy again. So this is like destructive from their side of things as well. Oh. We're inconveniencing them. We've now got a coach who's good at coaching kids, who's having to coach people who aren't too dissimilar to his age. You know, it gets a little bit weird, gets a little bit awkward. But anyway, we trained through the preseason, and this is the summer where Balotelli did the back heel in America. So there's a bit of a controversy around that as well.
He was going to join the week after.
Yeah, exactly. But they made it back. And I remember them coming back and thinking, okay, I'm still here. We're all still here. Okay, we're training at the same time. It's good to see them again because I never appreciated the value of being with your peers on a day-to-day basis until all of a sudden you're not with them anymore. So they made it back, but we were still training with the younger group. And one day in particular, our training session of the second team, wow, I don't even know what we're called. The ones just aren't required. We finished the training session and the team that traveled to the US for preseason were training on the other side. So myself, and I think it was Craig Bellamy, went over, sat down on a couple of footballs and watched the training session. Probably the worst decision of my entire career. because that evening we get a text message through again from the secretary saying, from tomorrow, do not come in to train at the normal time, which is like 10:30. Come in at 3 p.m. And again, you're like, 3 p.m. What's happened there?
And just before you go on, just to put the context as well, I know where Man City's training ground is just off the M6 near the Trafford Centre.
Yeah.
3 p.m. to people who don't realise is the beginning of the rush hour, you're stuck in traffic. 10:30 in the morning is fine, you can just breeze in, but it's the inconvenience of having to get to the traffic, and your kids might be leaving school at that time. Yeah. Just the whole point, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's that the inconvenience is the point. And like they'd basically tried to make it clear that like they didn't want us to be at the club anymore, but it didn't necessarily need to be in those terms. And it only came because all of a sudden we're watching their training session. And the 3 o'clock was also very significant because they knew, or rather the manager knew, that was the latest point that anyone would ever be at the training ground who'd done a training session in the morning.
Right.
So now we were fully separated, fully separated, having very different experiences. And as I look back now, like, I think what a messy situation for us as like first teamers, but also like, how about those like youngsters who thought they were having a nice, sane pre-season until all of a sudden they're so burdened with these players who the club really don't want there. And you having your ups and downs. Like, I remember at the very start of that pre-season point, Emmanuel Adebayor, like, you know, of Arsenal, Man City, Real Madrid, all that, he was really calm at the start of it. And then towards the end of it, you could see he was broken. And I don't blame him for the stuff that we were doing and how we were doing it. Just mentally, just couldn't keep coming in at that time anymore. Like, he was trying to work on his craft and so on, but like, he's not testing himself. He's playing against like kids. And of all those kids, I think maybe 2 or 3 of them maybe played at the high sort of level. But the rest, like, I don't even know if they're still playing to this day. So,
have you got an agent this time? So, are you trying to get out? Or are you a player that, I mean, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, everybody had agents. So, are you trying to get out, or are you just confused by the whole situation?
Well, it's both really. I have an agent, but I'm confused by the whole situation. And I think for myself, something that I tried to do throughout my career, whenever I say I wasn't starting, is I'd want to try and prove the manager wrong. And I would try and do that by, say, work I do in training and so on. So now you're in this position where like you're helpless to it. And a story which really stuck with me as well, which really emphasized that point in a negative manner, was like one of my favorite players growing up was Patrick Vieira. And he happened to come to City for maybe a year, 18 months, if that. One of the nicest guys I've ever met in football. And he wasn't at his absolute peak, obviously, when he was at City with me. But I remember sitting next to him and he's telling me a story about how he was at Inter Milan, I believe it was. And at the start of the season, he was told that he wasn't going to be part of their plans. I'm pretty sure Mourinho was the manager. He said he wasn't going to be part of their plans, but he's allowed to train with the team while he looks to find an option. And if he does well, who knows? By the start of the season, he was starting for Inter Milan. And I thought to myself, like, why can't that be a thing? Because you can be unwanted and still train with the first team. But when you then get taken away, all it does is breed resentment. And I think for some clubs as well, they try and save themselves money, because if a player, you know, requests to leave and so on, then they lose all the money that they're entitled to on their contracts and so on. But why would you as a player want to do that and give a club a favour when they've put you in a situation whereby you now dislike how they're treating you? And so yeah, it doesn't make sense really.
And if you're going in at 3 p.m, has the manager gone? I mean, do you get the chance to confront the manager and say, what's this all about? Has he gone?
No, you don't see anyone at all. And I think this is where there's sort of a difference, because the story I told about Vieira there, like, as I say, he spoke with the manager told him, when you have your coach in front of you, they can believe one thing, but you can at least try and sway them a little bit and show a sense of humanity, try and draw out a sense of humanity, because you're talking about what it means for you to still be part of that team. Talking about like if a manager says, oh, it's not going to work out, you need to find a club, you'll be like, okay, fine, you're disappointed, but maybe you'll try harder in training. Maybe you'll do everything you can, or maybe you'll just look for an opportunity. But when you don't even see them, it becomes this like mythical figure who's affecting your life from such a far distance that you can never get access to. And that's unfortunately how Mancini was. And I'm interested to see, say, whether it's at United or whether it was like at Chelsea, whether it was Maresca that told those players that they're going to be outside of it, or if it's going to be coming from somewhere else and they don't have access to the manager anymore. Because I promise you, that type of thing breeds huge, huge resentment. And that's not necessarily the type of feel that you want at a football club, because that person or those players who are now pushed to the side, they also have relationships with people who haven't been. So that even affects how they see the manager, because if it can happen to somebody that they believe in, why would it happen to them as well?
Can you tell me the story, Nedum? We've discussed it before about international breaks and you think you're going to get a week off and then suddenly you don't.
Yeah, this one was particularly significant for me. So when the transfer window closed that season, I happened to still be there, and so was Wayne Bridge. I think a lot of the others had left. So he's now lightly reintegrating us into the team to where we train every so often. And then when it's a match day, like, we're not involved and so on. But we're still training with the team now because basically the youth team are having to do other things. So Roberto was quite... He saw international breaks as being time for people to take a break, which is good, you know, if you have one of those managers, because some, maybe they go the other way. So it was September, it was October, it was the November international break, and players had been away. I think, like Gael Clichy, for example, when he wasn't playing for France, he'd have like an extended stretch off. So it was like the Wednesday or Thursday before the last game before the international break. And the manager says, everybody, I'm on the training pitch, Wayne is on the training pitch, everyone's there. Everyone that's not going away on international duty, you will be off from, say, the Saturday until a week on Monday, because it's the last international break. And he said, this is the last one before March. So it's an important time to have your rest and to come back mentally and physically ready to go for this next tough period and so on. So I was like, great. Having the season that I had, I thought, okay, let me try and go away somewhere. So I booked to go away somewhere with my wife, a last minute trip away. And then I didn't make the squad for the weekend. But when the game was over, I got a text again from the secretary, never from the manager, saying, you've actually got training Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday of the week, when he just told us previously that we were all off. And that was me and Wayne Bridge, nobody else. So I immediately tried to call the manager, rang 2 or 3 times, and then it got sent straight to voicemail. From then, it never rang out again. And I wasn't calling him to berate him. I was trying to call him to sort of ask why, and to almost express the importance of, like, why, you know, this could be a good thing for me to be being the same as everybody else. And you think that's bad enough in itself, but it wasn't, because from the Monday through to Friday, myself and Wayne, we trained with the reserves as such. But the worst bit was the Saturday, because on the Saturday, even the reserves were off. The reserves had the weekend off, and myself and Wayne and a fitness coach came in to do a gym session. And it felt like the most spiteful session I've ever had in my entire career. And again, that like brings, not like real, yeah, I suppose it did bring resentment, because it was a case of why. And I think for some managers, the best ones for me are the ones who can tell you a poor message, but deliver it in a softer sort of way, where they can understand how the decision they're making is going to affect you in a negative manner. But then the others who make decisions which will always be negative, but they'll never be the ones who'll have to pass on that message. And they'll never give you the feedback to know why it's happening, and never do it in a time whereby you could maybe put a positive spin on things. And unfortunately, that's what Roberto was at that time. I don't know if he's still the same today, but that's what he was at that time. And again, like, as a player, you can't help but build resentment. And people say, oh, but I'd do it for this amount of money, that amount of money. But these are like life-changing situations. And for me at the time, I'm lucky because I didn't have any children. But people like Wayne and others, they did. So these plans are affecting not just him, not just their partners and so on, but like their real day-to-day type life. And you go from having a routine where you train at this time and that's your job, to this whole other job, which is almost built around just making you as uncomfortable as possible.
So let's wrap it up with a bit of positivity, I guess. How did it end? And is there a message that you can say to the likes of Sterling and Disasi? Is the light at the end of the tunnel?
The light at the end of the tunnel, try and be positive. I think a lot of the time it's all about understanding the why. I think for Raheem, for Disasi, like, they will have options, but they still need to make sure they pick the right one, because at times I've seen people just pick any option that comes up on the radar just because they're so desperate to get out. But before you know it, then you're in a situation going forward which also isn't beneficial to you. I think they need to understand what they need from their next place of employment so they can potentially go somewhere and feel settled. Because, you know, at the moment, they're not even a talking point. You're talking about Raheem Sterling, who, you know, was playing for England like 4 years ago at the Euros and was a key player for them. Somebody who could potentially play for England again almost. So, and for Disasi, like, who knows, as a young player, who's just trying to establish himself in the English league as such. So I think it's more a case of, can you get a conversation with the manager? If you can get a conversation with the manager, I think your outlook could change. Because maybe then the manager is going to have to be apologetic to you to say why that you're not involved in the training group anymore. But you can then express your side of things so they can remember Because like Maresca's played, like remember how tough it is to be by yourself. Because it's great that like, you're a professional footballer, but having to bite your tongue and just get on with something which isn't beneficial to you. Like for Chelsea, listening to the talk is like, oh, well, we're providing them with the pitch to train on and, with kit. It's almost talking about them as if they're a free agent, you know what I mean? And they're looking for work somewhere. These are your players. So I think if they can find a way to sort of speak to the people who are in power, whether it's the manager and so on, maybe the outlook would change and maybe the two parties can work together to try and find that move instead of it feeling like one party saying, well, if you don't take this move, we'll make your life a living hell. But not every place offers that, but hopefully it does at Chelsea.
So how did your situation end, and did it end in a satisfactory way for you, or was it just to get out as quick as you can?
I ended up going in the January transfer window and I went to Queen's Park Rangers. This was the season when City ended up winning the league for the first time. But it was strange because I was out of the mix. I'd played in a couple of like League Cup games and so on. And then out of the blue in the January, I made a squad. And then Mancini, the manager, brought me on. I think it was against Wigan. And he brought me on for the last 10 minutes because they had a lead and needed someone to come and shore it up at the back. 2 days later, they accepted a bid and I was sent on my way. So I think mine ended because as a young person, I remember the advice I got from my agent at the time. And he said, you can't waste a year in football because you never know how many you're going to have. So I had to find a solution. And I was lucky enough that the manager QPR at the time was Mark Hughes, who was the last manager before Roberto Mancini came in. And I was playing week in, week out for Mark, basically. So that gave me an opportunity. And it wasn't like I was desperate to move to London or whatever. But I was moving to a place where I had a feeling that the manager knew what I was about. So I was going to get a chance to sort of redo my career, or at least get myself back on the pitch again with people who I've missed playing with and playing against. So it ended with a move. It wasn't necessarily the move that I wanted as such, because as a young person from Manchester coming through City's academy, playing for Man City, that's the only thing I ever wanted to do. But it's a reminder of the business of football. And in reality, sometimes you gotta try and find a solution. But thankfully, like City and myself found the right move for me in that moment.
Well, one of the biggest challenges we face as football reporters is sitting in a dull press conference and then trying to craft an interesting story from it. Occasionally, people like Jose Mourinho and Ruben Amorim will throw us a little bit of gold to work with, but it's not always the case. So to break down the relationship between managers and the media, we're joined by ESPN's Tom Hamilton and Tim Percival, communications lead of the England team at the RFU. Tim, you've just had a book published, On the Record and on the Ball, How Elite Coaches Master the Media. Can you just tell us a little bit about the book and what was the inspiration behind it?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. The book, I just thought people would be interested in it, really. It's not a subject that gets an enormous amount of, there's not an enormous amount written about it. So I thought people would be interested, first and foremost. And you'll know this, Rob, from your time as a reporter, is that sometimes sometimes there can be some friction between head coaches and the media. And it was my way of trying to kind of make both sides understand each other a bit better. So hopefully it does that, and hopefully it's a good read at the same time too.
You've spoken to a fair few of the world's football coaches, from Ange Postecoglou to Steve Cooper to Graham Potter to Emma Hayes. What were sort of the best anecdotes that really stuck with you from all the interviews you did?
Oh, I got loads, but there's some really good ones. And but one of the most interesting guys I spoke to, who was kind of really thought-provoking, was Tony Pulis, who obviously isn't kind of managing at the moment, but he was really, really thought-provoking, and he clearly thought a lot about that side of his job, perhaps more so than I gave him credit for. I'll give you an example. So there's a chapter in the book about mind games, and I argue that there's kind of 5 different types of mind game, one of which is reverse psychology. And he told me that when he was Stoke manager, in the first couple of seasons, he didn't lack for kind of material to use on his squad, to say the kind of world's against them. He'd have stuff in the media all the time, not giving them a chance. They were favourites to go down, etc. Anyway, he came to the 3rd season, and he said because they'd performed quite well in the 2 previous seasons, they were starting to be expected to win certain games. So I said to him, what did you do then? And he said, well, I just made stuff up. So I just walk into the changing room, walk into team meetings, and I would make things up that the media had said in order to try and galvanize his squad to try and create this kind of feeling that no one gave them a chance. So I thought was just fascinating.
Did you like with in The Last Dance where Michael Jordan basically says that he fabricated a scenario with a player? The guy said, "See you in the gym," or whatever. Have you seen that with other coaches as well? I know perhaps one of your guys you've worked with in the past may or may not have done that as well. But in terms of football, do you think that's an effective tactic, or do you think there's got like a bit of a shelf life?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that there are examples where that reverse psychologist, worked in the past. I definitely do. I think the issue, and I think, like sports psychologists, performance psychologists would probably tell you this, is kind of where do you go next? So you can't keep doing that. And, I suppose I'll make the point in the book is that, Mourinho was a kind of master of creating this kind of siege mentality and using this kind of reverse psychology as a tool. But, he doesn't often stay in jobs more than, maybe 3 or 4 seasons, and maybe he kind of runs out of material. But without question, I think it's effective in certain with certain teams. But where you have to be careful is, where do you go next? And also you don't necessarily want to kind of alienate the team to the media, which I also don't think is particularly wise.
Are there any common mistakes, do you think, when we see managers handle the media? Things that you see, maybe managers you spoke to for the book have kind of said that they made mistakes when handling the media. Is there anything in particular that you think is a wrong way to do it? Have you seen instances of that?
Yeah, I suppose the one that sticks out to me is I think body language is really, really important in an interview. And, I think it's something like 70 to 80% of, what you say is, via your kind of body language. People are picking up on those kind of visual cues, aren't they? And I think particularly in the Premier League, kind of looking beleaguered when you walk into press conferences and post-match flash interviews, I think is a mistake. And I think football managers need to be really careful about that. And I think it is a mistake that they can fall into. It is a trap. And don't get me wrong, it's incredibly hard, isn't it? You come off a bad defeat or a poor decision, and then suddenly there's a microphone under your nose and you're being interviewed in the tunnel not long after enormous amounts of pressure. But I think that football managers need to kind of train themselves to go into a kind of press conference, particularly in those kind of high pressure moments when things are tense, and train themselves to get into a mindset where they look bulletproof. Because I think journalists can pick up on those kind of visual cues, and their editorial will reflect that.
It's interesting because it's interesting you talk about the timing of the interviews, because obviously I have to deal with Ruben Amorim quite a lot, and one of the things that they say about him at United is that he doesn't give post-match dressing room debriefs because he feels like he's too emotional. So he won't ever talk to the players because he just feels that he's too emotional, and he'll do it the next day. But obviously he can't get away from handling his media duty. So he's comes off games which, if you look at his reign, invariably have been with poor results. He has a microphone thrust under his nose. He's got to kind of answer these questions on the hop. And actually the one that he gave after Grimsby, he was very, very emotional and kind of said all this stuff that actually made the result even worse, because all this stuff that he came out with about, we have to talk to the board and you can change a manager but not 22 players. All this stuff made the situation worse. And he said afterwards in his next pre-match press conference, he was just simply too emotional. That actually what he needed to do is go and sit in a dark room for 10 minutes, kind of gather his thoughts, and then come out and be a bit more kind of measured. But he just didn't have the time to do that.
I mean, that doesn't surprise me. Someone as smart as him, because I think he's a brilliant media operator, but also there's a bit of self-leadership there in recognising where he's made a mistake. I mean, I think he's a brilliant media operator. He is honest to a fault, as you say. I mean, probably too honest after that Grimsby game. But there's something about his honesty that is really endearing, and it builds connections with the supporters. I know they want better results, but I think honesty is certainly a way of kind of building those connections and respect with supporter base. Just anecdotally on the Grimsby thing, he doesn't need my advice because I think he's a brilliant operator, and particularly his command of language for someone who's speaking in his second language, really, really impressive, and that's a great skill in itself. But just on the Grimsby game, I don't know what your thoughts on this, but the one thing that I was just surprised about in that, and this is more of a kind of psychological kind of observation, is that he didn't watch the penalties, did he, in the closing moment? And I was just amazed by that. I would love to know what a psychologist would make of that. But that is the perception of not watching those just really, really surprised me that he chose to do that.
Yeah, the penalties thing I thought was a little bit odd. I know that players don't. I mean, Casemiro doesn't watch penalties, apparently. That even if he's on the pitch and his teammate is taking a penalty, will turn his back and face the other way. It's just a superstition thing, and I think it's the same with Amorim. But you're right. I mean, I think it was interesting after that Grimsby game that kind of meme that went round of him with his tactics board, him not watching the penalties, and then all the stuff that happened in the post match press conference all contributed to this kind of like disaster scenario that had grown far bigger than the actual result. If he kind of managed the other bits in a different way, maybe the result wouldn't have been. It's obviously a bad result. You can't get away from that, but it wouldn't have been hung out as such a bad result if he'd handled the different elements of it differently.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and again, I don't know what you think, Tom, but I just think it's something about the perception of that, of kind of, I don't know, perhaps it's just me, but it kind of shows kind of anxiety and you don't want to, you want to be seen kind of fronting up and being stoic and part of the group and together. But he went and sat on his own and watched them. I was just surprised by that. Well, and just in the context of whilst we're talking about body language, I suppose.
What have you made of the way that Ange Postecoglou handles media? I know that you've got him in your book. We saw him at the end with Spurs. He was almost quite defiant, but also realistic and very abrasive at times. At Forest already, first press conference, I'd say it's him putting down a marker, the way that he was trying to say who he is again, and he knows that he has people who doubt whether he was the right man for the job and doubt him as a manager. He seems to be quite abrasive and seems to try and go on the front foot. Is that just his nature, or do you think that's a carefully planned tactic from him?
Well, I just think he is unapologetically himself, which I love. And like the first piece of advice I'd give to anyone giving a media interview, whether it was like, the chief exec of, a company or a football manager, is to kind of be yourself. And I think he is unapologetically kind of Ange Postecoglou. And that authenticity, I think, really helps him build, again, connections with people. I also think he's one of those guys who kind of, instead of speaking, he wants to be heard. He wants to get his messages across, and there's kind of no polish there. And he's just that kind of knockabout Aussie that I think that people relate to. I have to say, I think he's an absolutely brilliant communicator. Yeah, he can have a crack at people and you can show some emotion, but I think support bases want you to see you show emotion within reason. I think the most interesting thing he said to me, one of the most interesting things he said to me when I interviewed him for the book, was the importance he puts on kind of fronting up, kind of facing the media, whether it's going well or whether it's, things are challenging. He told me how important that was to kind of front up, try and explain, try and get your messages across. And as you say, show a bit of kind of defiance if things are tough. I just really admire him as a communicator. I think he's great, and I can kind of, and he must be great. He's obviously great for you guys, but I think he kind of connects with people. And I felt sorry for him at Tottenham personally, but that's it.
Who for you stands out in the Premier League then at the moment, and in the way that they interact and sort of handle the media?
Well, can I cheat?
No. Yeah. All right. Go on.
Well, I mean, if you're going to pick out a really brilliant communicator, you'd have to go for Jurgen Klopp. I mean, lots of the things that we've already spoken about with Amorim and with Postecoglou, where he's kind of authentic and there's humour in there, and again, he's got a great command of language as someone who's speaking in his second tongue. Where I think he was particularly impressive which was perfectly suited to a club like Liverpool, was that he managed to kind of set the right tone when he's speaking to his support base and the audiences that he spoke to. And I think that is particularly skillful, just kind of setting the right tone. The other thing that made him impressive was that he was prepared to speak about issues beyond football. And, the vast majority of football managers won't go there. Because we live in an age where, the slightest kind of transgression, you kind of get torn to shreds, don't you? But, he was prepared to go in kind of different directions beyond football. And I admire people who want to do that as well, because there is risk there. Gareth Southgate was another one who was prepared to do that, who talked about societal issues and so on and so forth. And that just makes, I have an enormous amount of respect for them. But, Klopp's kind of, range of kind of emotion and passion, I just thought absolute master.
Well, I know we've spoken about Ruben Amorim previously. Obviously, I've had to deal with a lot of Man United managers. I remember Fergie used to say that he used to like long questions in press conferences because it gave him a chance to think of his answer. He hated the kind of short, sharp ones because it felt like he caught him off guard. With Jose, obviously, everyone will know about how Jose handles the media. What was interesting with Jose, I thought, was that he often used the media to send messages to players. And there was instances when he was at Old Trafford of players messaging journalists to find out what had been said in the embargoed section of press conferences. So they kind of got a heads up about what was coming because they just didn't want to see it drop at 10:30 because they thought that they might get caught off guard. With Amorim, I think a lot of it is, he said himself in his press conference after the game on Saturday, someone asked him about that Pope quote and he said, I don't know why you're laughing, guys. You all love it. And if you all behave yourself, I'll give you more gold next time. I think that's quite a kind of clever way sometimes of diffusing quite a tough situation, obviously, that he's going through right now. I mean, what have you made of how he does it? Do you think there's anything he could do better? Have you been quite impressed with the ways? I mean, you mentioned there that he's doing it all in his second language as well, which again, I think is worthy of kind of a bit of credit.
Well, I'll give I love the Pope stuff. I thought that was funny, and also didn't he say when Jim Ratcliffe was kind of came into it for a meeting, he said he'd here to offer him as another contract.
First thing he said when he walked in.
And I think, look, I'm going to make just on that humour stuff. I'm going to make a kind of strategic point here: is that humour can be a really clever way of dealing with stuff, particularly. Particularly if you're under pressure. Where you see it often, I think where some managers are really skillful with it, is that if there's been, a kind of controversial moment in the game and managers know they're going to be asked about that post-match, if they make a joke about something, they can kind of make a point without getting in trouble with the authority, the FA, if you see what I mean. So I remember there was that one from Gary Monk, I think he was the Swansea manager, and there was a big controversial handball, and he said, I didn't realise you could have two goalkeepers. And that's a kind of way of making his point, but without getting himself in trouble. But I just think humour, again, you talk about, there's that kind of strategic benefit, but humour, I just think, helps connect with people, and that's what communication is about, isn't it? It's about, you're not just passing on information, you're trying to connect with people. And I think Amorim using kind of humour in the same way that Klopp does, and someone like who's the ex-Blackpool manager who I love, whose name is
Ian Holloway.
Yeah, Ian Holloway. But it's this, something about the way that they use humour, and I think Amorim does that very skillfully, despite the fact that obviously the results aren't as good as he'd like to be at the moment. I think that helps him. As I say, like I feel like I'm kind of labouring a point, but kind of connect with people and for people to kind of listen to what he's saying.
Just one last one from me. I mean, I know that lots of football fans may listen to this and think, well, what does it matter what managers say in interviews and press conferences? I know that, again, when I was covering United, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer thought that him putting pressure on referees ahead of City games and alerting referees to tactical fouls that Pep Guardiola's team would usually employ, he felt that was really important, and the chance to get it across in public kind of helped his team in those games. And again, Erik ten Hag, United offered him the chance a couple of times for Steve McLaren to take a couple of press conferences just to take the load off, and he said, no, it's really important that the manager of Man United is there to control the message. So obviously managers feel like it's important. I mean, why do you feel like it is important for managers, whether it's rugby or football or whatever sport, to kind of be the voice of that team and control the narrative and the kind of the message around what's happening?
Well, I'd echo those points. I mean, I think that's spot on with Ten Hag and Solskjaer. I mean, look, first and foremost, like you're right. The basis of the question is, look, you've got to win games of football, but good communication and understanding some of the stuff that you just summarised, but can buy managers time. You can get messages across that you want to try and articulate, and I think that is incredibly important. I'll give you a good example. Well, hopefully I'll give you a good example. So I remember with Arteta in his first season at Arsenal, he had the Amazon All or Nothing documentary following him around, which, by the way, is incredibly tough for managers, particularly someone like that in a big job. It was his big first head coach role, wasn't it? And I think that despite the fact that I think they had kind of relatively poor season by their standards, because you could see Amorim, and this isn't necessarily in a press conference, but through that documentary, because you could see how passionate he was for the club, how much he cared about the club, how hard he was working. I think that did a lot to win over an enormous amount of Arsenal's supporter base, and it's for that reason, I think that beyond the results, making sure that you're trying to get those messages across to your supporters and to the boardroom and so on and so forth. That is incredibly important, and it's your opportunity to do that every time you sit in front of the media. So I'd agree with Ten Hag. The sentiment of Ten Hag is that is your opportunity to kind of explain things and to put messages out there and to kind of try and control the message.
On the other hand, what did you make of what Nuno did earlier in the season when he basically pressed the nuclear option and talked about his relationship with Marinakis? Was that, when you saw that, did you immediately think, I know what he's doing here? Like, he's trying to get out? Or...
I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm being wise after the event, but that looked pretty planned. If you ask me, I'll never know, and perhaps we'll never know, but only he will know that. But I think when you start talking about your employers, you're on a pretty dangerous road. And I would say 99.9% of the, managers in the whole of the league understand that. I spoke to Harry Redknapp about that, actually, and he said that during his time when he was Leeds manager, they sold Ferdinand for that big fee to United, didn't they? And he said he was promised that he'd be able to spend that money, and he said a few things in the press, and he just said, look, the boardroom were watching, and eventually it was thanks very much, goodbye. You look, if you're going to talk about your employers, you can do things, that is an audience you can speak to, and you can be strategic about that, but I think it is a pretty dangerous game. I mean, don't you?
Pretty much, yeah. I think it was quite clear what he was doing at the time.
I think that's the one kind of no-go, isn't it, in press conferences, if you begin talking about your employers and kind of criticising them openly, that immediately people see that there's a rift there that probably should be kept behind closed doors. You're obviously doing that for a reason. Nuno's always manages his press conferences quite well. I feel that he doesn't ever give anything away unless he absolutely wants to. So the very fact that he, for one of the only times I've ever seen him in a news conference give away something like that, suggested that it was very much part of his plan, and that it may not be the next day or the day after, but there was certainly kind of the end was nigh kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it just looks so deliberate, didn't it?
I've got one last question. When the managers say that they don't read the media, is that rubbish?
I don't know. I mean, going back to Tony Pulis, he told me that he would have an assistant coach read it all and then flag anything, because he's like, look, I don't have time to read it all. I mean, I think not reading stuff is quite hard work, and I know that sounds really daft, but particularly Premier League managers, that they've got friends who are going to be flagging articles and so on and so forth. And it's very, very difficult to avoid the media altogether. But maybe you should do what Tony Pulis does and just get someone else to read it for you and flag anything that you think is a concern. I thought that was a pretty good way of dealing with it.
Well, thanks, Tim, for coming on and offering your insight, and also thanks to Tom for joining us. That was great. Thanks very much.
Oh, you're welcome.